Good morning, everyone, and welcome to a discussion about financing nature, closing the biodiversity gap. I don't know whether you're sitting in America, Europe, or Asia, but we are indeed one world. We need to address this issue as one world, and we have a range of speakers to talk to us today. Now, in the last few years, we've heard a lot about the issue of climate change and carbon emissions. We've heard far less about the question of biodiversity. So the key aim of today's discussion is to put this on the agenda of financial sector, business leaders, and policymakers. And to explain to us why that is so critically important, we're going to start with Hank Paulson, former Treasury Secretary, former Wall Street luminary, and now someone who's campaigning very actively to make us all think about the question of the environment and climate change, and most importantly, biodiversity. Secretary Paulson, over to you to explain to us why this matters.
Thank you, Gillian. It's great to be here alongside such an esteemed group to launch the findings of our new report, Financing Nature, Closing the Global Biodiversity Financing Gap. And a big thank you to Jen Morris, president of the Nature Conservancy, who you'll hear from later in the program, as well as the researchers at the Cornell Atkinson Center for Sustainability for partnering with the Paulson Institute on this report. Today's event is occurring against a distressing backdrop. We've all seen the headlines this month of raging fires on the West Coast and hurricanes in the South, but too often ignored is a related crisis afflicting the world's biodiversity. How many of your friends and family know that the world is in the midst of one of the most dramatic extinction episodes in history, occurring at 1,000 times the natural rate? If we continue on this path, we could lose up to half of all species by the middle of this century. This is an obvious danger that we can't afford to let spiral out of control. The good news is that we have the policies, tools, and knowledge necessary to make a difference. We just need to put them to use. And in my view, few people are better positioned to talk about how to do so than our distinguished panelists. Thank you, Cristalina, Luis Alberto, and Tom for lending us your expertise today. And without further ado, I'll hand this off to Gillian to get us started.
Well, thank you very much indeed. And we have a terrific group of people to talk about these issues. I would urge everyone watching to read the report because it does lay out a very sobering a report card on the state of affairs, but also a very powerful call to action. We have Cristalina Georgieva, who is the Managing Director of the IMF. We have Tom Lovejoy, who's Senior Fellow of the United Nations Foundation, and Luis Alberto Moreno, who is President of the Inter-American Development Bank. And all of you are essentially at the nexus of policy making, politics, finance, economics, and business. I'd like to start with you, Cristalina, because apart from the fact I know you have to leave us a bit early, but you are sitting atop an organization with a lot of money to spread around the world. Historically, the IMF has not paid much attention to questions of climate change. That has started to change recently. But how much is the IMF looking at issues of biodiversity today?
Let me first express my admiration for Hank Paulson for his incredible commitment and leadership, and say how wonderful it is to be with Tom and Luis Alberto, people who I know not only care deeply about the topic we discuss, but are doing a lot pragmatically to put us on a sound footing. So why is the IMF concerned about climate, biodiversity, environmental sustainability? To put it in our language, because they are macro critical. We cannot have financial stability if we don't have environmental and social sustainability. And we can do so much better in creating jobs and improving the livelihoods of people if we think of our planet, of our natural capital, as part of this equation that is critical for growth, for jobs, for well-being. And I would give you two examples so I can make this concrete. Take the question of productivity. If ecosystems are depleted, if our land is degraded, if our oceans are polluted, then the ability to produce food, fisheries, on which many poor people depend, is seriously damaged. So if we want to have an economy that prospers, we have to think of our planet not only as home of all species, but also the home of us people. People and planet are so interdependent. And for far too long, we thought about nature as being limitless and of its resources as being free of charge. Now we recognize that that concept ought to change. And my second example is on what concretely it means in our work. One of our IMF economists recently concentrated on whales. And he discovered that whales are not just, wonderful creatures, but they are a great carbon sequester. And that if we were to restore the whales population to a sustainable level, that would be an equivalent of 10 billion trees being planted. And that one whale brings $2 million worth of value by doing this service. So what we wanted to fund is to integrate biodiversity with the language we speak, which is the language of economics and finance. And so we can have a sound foundation for the well-being of people and, of course, for the prospects of a sustainable future.
Well, thank you. That's fascinating. I never thought I'd see the day when the IMF was doing a study on whales. Maybe we can look forward to a financial assessment of the impact of whales in the future. But I'm curious, can you get enough hard data, enough hard numbers about biodiversity to actually bake that into your economic models? And I'm going to turn to Luis Moreno in just a moment. But Cristina, can you get enough data to actually track this in a way that your IMF economists would essentially think has credibility?
Well, this is where we actually rely a lot on studies as the one that is being launched today. We get inputs from other organizations, and we are working very hard together with our sister organization, the World Bank, on valuing natural capital and integrating it in our traditional accounting. So what we now know as a result of this work is that poor countries are more dependent on natural capital than rich countries are. And if we are concerned about development in poor parts of the world, we ought to be integrating on a country-by-country basis in our analysis that assessment of natural capital, and then make sure that what we recommend for growth is harmonious, that we look at investments in people, in human capital, we look at investments in physical capital, but we put on equal footing investments in natural capital. And that work is now getting integrated in IMF assessments to a point that I can proudly say that in our recommendations for growth, we are much more holistic today than we were 5 or 10 years ago. Nature matters for the economy and the well-being of people.
Well, that's fascinating. I must say, one of the reasons I'm involved in this is because the Financial Times just over a year ago launched a platform called Moral Money, which looks at these issues within the framework of finance and business. And we track very closely what our readers are interested in. And the phrase natural capital is quite a massive buzzword right now amongst our readers. We can see that people hit on articles with those words included. So certainly there is a shift in emphasis and focus, not just at the IMF. But I'd like to bring in Luis Moreno here because, as president of the Inter-American Development Bank, you have a continent which is poor, which is very exposed to a lot of these issues, as Cristina has said, but also a place that has one of the biggest sources of natural capital, the Amazon forest, amongst other causes of natural capital. I'm curious, do you think these issues are being taken more seriously now? And how is the Inter-American Development Bank factoring this into practical policy making or the disbursement of finance?
Well, thank you very much, Gillian. And let me begin by thanking very much Hank Paulson for this report. I think this is extremely timely, and the work that he continuously does in raising this very important issue, and of course to be with Cristalina and Tom is really great. Let me begin by saying, you were mentioning Latin America, and we will have the Biodiversity Summit this year. There's a big report being produced in the UK, as you know well. But Latin America has about 11% of the land mass of the world, and it has close to 40% of the biodiversity of the world. So if you think in terms of what Cristalina was saying, here is 40% of unvalued capital in countries. And the question that one has is, the thing I like about this report is that it's very conversant, unlike most other, environmental type reports, that gets closer to the financial issues, where it begins to create a path forward on how to do this. For instance, there's a lot of talk about subsidies. We all know that subsidies always there is an owner of that subsidy, and it's very hard to remove. The question is, how can you help countries bridge that? And there's some things that have been done. We've done it at the IDB, for instance, taking the case of how you can demonstrate that you're storing CO2 emissions in the rainforest of any one of the countries. And then the government of Norway, for instance, has been very active in this regard and pays against outcomes. There's a lot of models that can begin to be explored. The question is, how do you begin to do the bridge on that? So we have constantly at the IDB seen success in projects that both quantify the value of natural capital in economic terms, and more importantly, that bring all the actors to increase investment in conservation. And we have done this in a variety of countries, from watersheds in Brazil and Colombia, and in Costa Rica and the Dominican Republic, in countries like Ecuador and Mexico, that today cover more than 1.6 million hectares of ecosystems. And these projects equally have leveraged, and when you think about these amounts, given the outcomes, they've leveraged more than $120 million in green infrastructure and benefited more than 70 million people. So we have helped countries integrate natural capital into their ministries of planning and infrastructure to lend to countries like the Bahamas, for instance, to create economic development plans that include important natural capital investments. So a lot of what needs to be done and all what development banks need to do is to help kind of create that whole wiring of what needs to happen inside governments as a whole of government approach to begin to do this. And of course, there are new tools that are being developed to quantify the economic benefits of natural infrastructure and develop models that are predictive and that you can determine the trade-offs, economic growth and natural resource investment. And we are actually looking at an innovative payment system of habitat conservation through the compensation through banking or private investment in areas of agroforestry, and something that has begun to take a lot of ground, which is the question of agroforestry and silvopastoral investments. These are things that are getting more and more awareness, as Cristalina was saying. This is what societies today demand. People were in the streets in Latin America protesting, not unlike the Gilets Jaunes in France. And they were largely asking, among other things, to really protect the environment. This is something that today is in the streets, and we need today, with stories like this one, to advance this agenda and help materialize the way of how we get this funding streams to go into this investment.
Well, I'm curious. Before I ask Tom, I'd like to bring both Kristalina and Louis in on this issue. To what degree are you working with private sector financial companies to try and have a coordinated and collaborative approach towards baking this into financial decision making? Or do you think you're just setting down a template that you hope that private sector companies can then follow? Or is there a danger that the fact you're doing this will essentially mean that the multilateral groups are being virtuous and baking this in, and private sector companies will simply pick up the rest?
This is for me?
Yes, either Louis, or actually
Okay.
either Louis or Kristalina. Sorry, not you, Tom. Either Louis or Kristalina.
Kristalina.
Well, the story is one that is evolving over time. We are yet to see environmental sustainability integrated massively in finance, but the direction to travel is the right one. Two examples. One, sustainability investment. It was minuscule, more like a boutique investment, but we now see big investment companies embracing ESG and trying to make it meaningful for the way they run their business. And the evidence is that sustainability oriented companies actually do better. We see the same thing on the side of green bonds. I was at the World Bank when in 2007 we issued the first green bond. That was for a while, again, a very limited universe. But we are seeing over the last years, especially the last 2-3 years, a boost in additions of green bonds to a point that they are now 3, 4, 5%. They're leaning in that direction. And of course, we hope that to get further. We just got the European Commission announcing they're going to move in their bond issuance as much green as possible. So why is that important in the world of finance? And how can we help to make it even more accelerated? It is important because we are to see effective growth only on the basis of integrating environmental sustainability, also anti-corruption, good governance. Only then we can get robust growth everywhere. But for us, it is also important because we can help accelerate it by giving sound foundation on standards for disclosure. So firms actually can present in a measurable, compatible way what is it that they are integrating as environmental reporting. And we can help, especially from the IMF, to stress test financing on the basis of sustainability. We are now working very hard to support stress tests in terms of climate risks, and we know climate and biodiversity are connected. The fund invented stress tests some 20 years ago for banks to be financially sound. And what we want to see now is that they are also environmentally sound. Why? Because if they're not, we would be in big trouble. And Hank talked about it. We are going to lose biodiversity, not only an aesthetic loss, it is a huge loss in terms of the productivity of ecosystems, their ability to sustain us as human race.
Yeah, well, the numbers in the report are absolutely terrifying, frankly. But also what's also quite terrifying is the scale of finance, which will be needed to actually address that. Before I turn to Tom, Louis, do you have any hope or faith that there will be enough financing to try and counter this serious problem in the Latin American area?
Look, I think there's far more money that is going to be needed. But as always happens with these things, you gotta You know where the needs are, you know where the financing is. What is always the trick is getting the projects to actually come together. And this is what development institutions try to work precisely in that kind of sweet spot, which is extremely difficult. But for instance, we've done in a country like Peru with a second-tier financial institution, ways to create special purpose vehicles, for instance, for bioeconomy investment. We have also been working in how to take risk and incubating new products. For example, we are creating an exchange for the value of natural capital, so you can monetize the intrinsic value of natural capital through IPOs. This is essentially like taking the rainforest public. Now, to do that, the whole regulatory aspects, everything that goes behind it, the determination of the areas that you're protecting, all of that is extremely complex, but it's something that we have been making some advance. We looked, for instance, at some of the species bonds. Cristina was talking about whales. In Africa, for instance, there was the so-called rhino bond, which is a way to develop ways to protect certain species that are at risk, and you could equally do the same with a number of species that are at risk, that basically are alive because of how we protect or not the rainforest. And I know Tom can speak to that much more. We equally have worked with the Nature Conservancy, what we call the water funds. These are ways to protect the factories of water that we have. The biggest factory of water, of natural water, in all of the world is in South America. How do you protect it? Well, it turns out that there's hundreds of people in these communities that begin to take down the forest near those watersheds or that invade them. The minute that all of a sudden you bring the people together and you find the way to have the ecosystem services to be paid, be it, especially for instance, big beverage companies, I'm talking the massive companies, they are all very interesting in paying those services in as much as they know that on the other side, you're actually protecting their main source of an input for their product, which is water.
Well, I must say,
can I before I move, can I just bring one interesting question? When we look into the future, one of the problems of tomorrow coming out of this pandemic is going to be higher debt. And I fondly remember the days when debt and nature were connected with debt for nature swaps. So I would be really interested, what do Tom and Hank think about marrying two problems with one solution, debt and nature? Can we bring some forward thinking on that front?
Well, that seems like a great moment to bring Tom into the conversation. Tom, what do you think about that?
So I think there's all kinds of possibilities along those lines. Now, Debt for Nature originated in 1984 with a lot of private bank debt from mostly Latin American nations, but it quickly, moved to other kinds of debt. And the key in all of this is actually removing a hard currency obligation for a country or even a corporation in return for spending local currency on environmentally important things like biodiversity conservation. And in the end, everybody gains.
So, Tom, do you think that could be replayed again now? And do you have any hope that it might be on the agenda of the upcoming UNGA meetings, for example, because we are heading towards those in the next couple of weeks?
So I actually have heard a fair amount of discussion about this, whether it's debt for climate or debt for nature. It's definitely in the air.
And what do you think that needs to be done on behalf of the United Nations right now to try and marshal these, marshal the resources in the public and private sector and play a coordinating role to make this happen?
So the United Nations is going to actually focus on biodiversity at the General Assembly. There are also major meetings on biodiversity under the UN conventions in the coming year or two. But the real key here will be to bring the private sector and national governments into this as well, which is why having partnerships with organizations like IMF and the IDB are just essential.
I'm curious, I'd like to ask all of you this question. Climate change is a polarizing issue politically. Some countries, some regions have embraced it, some parties have embraced it, others have definitely not. Do you think that talking about natural capital and biodiversity might be one way to get more cross-political coordination and buy-in, and even cross-regional buy-in to actually address these issues? Because, biodiversity in some ways is less about blaming or measuring who's a sinner and who's a saint. It's more about trying to pull people together. I'm curious, Kristalina, do you think you have a better chance of getting more global and cross-political coordination on, if you say the word biodiversity instead of climate change?
What I am confident we would see is more soberness coming out of this pandemic, because what it has done for us all is to remind us that we are in a shock-prone world. And whether it is the crisis of nature, the collapse of ecosystems, or it is a crisis that comes from hurricanes and destructive floods, these are things that people today are more thoughtful about. And I think that this is going to be a call for all of us to think comprehensively about how economies succeed and recognize that we have to build a more resilient world for the future. And a more resilient world means also the resilience of rivers and land and our oceans. So I think it is indeed a moment when perhaps the focus is more around how we can sustain shocks, how we can build also the natural barriers, the natural resistance to these shocks, which is a subject of today's conversation.
Right. Now, Christina, I know that due to the incredibly important work you're doing, you're kind of vanished at this point. So thank you for your contributions, and best of luck in trying to bake in natural capital and getting equations to measure the value of whales. I look forward to reading that sometime soon. But I'd like to bring in Louis. Louis, in terms of your, looking at a continent where politicians don't all have the same attitude towards climate change. I mean, the Brazilian government, by way of example, has taken a very different approach from those that environmentalists would like to see. Do you think talking about natural capital is a way to get a broader buy-in?
Look, I would say in our hemisphere, people see the consequences of climate change, and they see them by what we've seen in the fires in the Amazon, or the hurricanes in the Caribbean, or the droughts throughout Central America and Mexico. So people see the consequences. As you begin to talk more about the natural capital, the biodiversity, this is what people are in touch with every day. And the more that they see the value of conserving it, I think that is where we need to be much smarter in ways of communicating the connectivity between destruction of the rainforest and climate change. Because people, if they don't have an option, if they don't have electricity and they have to get wood to cook, they're going to go to the rainforest and destroy it. Or for that matter, if they think that they can have cattle or plant whatever product they want for their life subsistence. So it's very important to have the kinds of elements to protect the rainforest, like has been done for many years, for instance, in protected areas. The so-called protected areas, and then the plus-up of are of those protected areas. We have done those programs in Brazil, or for instance, with low carbon agriculture. Things like that are doable, and people, once they see them working, they begin to really price that. And the other part is, how do you develop other forms of income? For instance, bird watching is a great example. You know, the minute that you have, you know, over 800 varieties of birds, something Wendy knows very well, Paulson here, and Hank as well. You know, you can get people who are naturally going to protect the rainforest. They don't need, you know, mega hotels. They rather live in the basic nature where it is. And, you know, managing things like this are critical. Costa Rica started years ago in ecotourism. They were one of the first countries in the Americas to do just that. Today, over 50% of their tourism is dependent on ecotourism. So these are the kinds of areas that one has to work. And you're right that politically it's easier to talk about this, but in you know, when you feel the challenges that people see, there is the reason that you've seen all this discussion in Brazil, which is fascinating to watch, is that all of a sudden you're starting to see this coalition to protect everything around the Brazilian rainforest. And it's always been very important to Brazilians. You know, historically, you know, 70 years ago, the military in Brazil thought that they needed to protect the rainforest because otherwise somebody was going to take it away from them. So there is a lot of nationalistic areas about this. And the question is now, how do you create this kind of coalitions that bring everybody together around protection and finding ways to create and finance, you know, forest guards, protected areas, etc.
Thank you. Well, I could see that when you mentioned the word birds, Secretary Paulson suddenly perked up and looked like you want to jump in. I'm going to bring you in just a minute and hand back over to you. But before I do, I want to quickly ask Tom again, in your views, is there anything the United Nations needs to be doing to communicate this message more forcefully to the finance sector and the wider public?
So I think many of the messages in the report that's being launched today should be part of what they're trying to communicate. And I think it's really important not to think of all these environmental issues as in little separate compartments, because biodiversity is actually all built of carbon. And there is so much destroyed nature that has thrown carbon up into the atmosphere that it's literally equal to what remains in extant nature. So if you start thinking about all of this holistically, you do good things for the climate, and you do good things for biodiversity, and in turn, you're doing great things for people and economies.
Right. So you need basically to move the focus from not just the Greta Thunberg carbon emission point, but talk about a wider canvas. Secretary Paulson, Hank, any surprises from the conversation so far, or any points you'd like to illuminate or highlight?
Well, what I'd like to do is, well, we've got Tom here. Tom is really the man who coined the term biodiversity. He's the man who invented the debt for nature swap. And I also think he can talk, you know, in a few words, explain to the people on this call the importance of the Amazon, what's going on in terms of the threat, what he sees as the tipping point, and how important that biodiversity, that source of biodiversity, the tropics really are to this overall conversation.
Well, thank you, Hank. The Amazon is literally the largest repository of biodiversity on Earth. It is a gigantic forest, and it makes half of its own rainfall. And that's because the trees and the leaves actually regenerate moisture after a rainfall. And it is such a vast hydrological cycle that it actually contributes moisture to every country in South America except for Chile. So even central Brazilian agriculture depends on it, but northern Argentina does as well. So there has been sufficient deforestation that the Amazon is really right at a tipping point where the southern and eastern parts of it could convert to a savanna. The good news is some serious efforts at reforestation can build back that margin of safety. So it's not only the continental climate system that's at risk here, it's just a treasury of biological diversity which can provide all kinds of benefits for humanity into the future.
Right.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
No. And just one other question I've got for the panel, and this is for Luis Alberto, that because the IDB has been doing so much work with the private sector and working with the governments in the region. Luis Alberto, you just might just say a few words about the work with the Letitia Pact, working with the 8 heads of state that control part of the Amazon, and where biodiversity figures into that, because I think that's a big part of the equation. And one of the things you've done is looped in finance ministers, because in the past, these discussions have mainly involved environmental ministers, foreign ministers, but the key here, I think, is getting finance ministers to be part of this discussion. And so, Luis, over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Hank. And this is something that, with both you and Tom, we have been working, as you know. The Leticia Pact was really an ad hoc kind of head of state creation that took place at the initiative of the President of Colombia. And it happened about a year ago. And it was a recent summit. And the purpose is to begin to have a notion that you got to look at the Amazon as a system, as Tom Lovejoy always reminds us. And as you start to look at it as a system, then you begin to put in place the kinds of needs it has. And what we have been tasked by the Leticia Pact is to create a fund such that you can bring monies from different parts of the world, from donor countries or asset managers that want to invest around areas of protection of the biodiversity. And for this, of course, it's critical to have the ministries of finance, because they are the ones that can have the ways of creating the need of the regulatory systems that need to be in place, such that any one asset manager or donor country is going to want to see exactly where that money went and how is it being used to deal with the challenges in preserving the rainforest. One of the interesting things that we have seen recently in Brazil is this big coalition that has been created that basically is being led, among others, by the 4 major banks of Brazil, precisely to start to look at ways to invest more in the Amazon. So I think these are the kinds of private sector-led initiatives where people want to take a stake, and which actually is an action forcing event that if you have finance ministers in place, if you have the will of the heads of state, you begin to get some traction.
Well, I must say, I find that fascinating because you mentioned earlier, Louis, that the Rhino bond was issued last year. When it was issued, we noticed at the Financial Times that we had an explosively high level of interest from readers in the Rhino bond. We can tell in terms of what stories are most read, and that was one of the most read. And that, to me, in some ways, illustrates the essential point of this panel, which is that we have an absolutely horrific biodiversity crisis. There are financial tools, innovations, and commitments emerging to try and reshape finance and business to address that. There is interest amongst the public and amongst investors to a growing degree. The question is how to marshal it in the most effective way possible. And I never thought I'd come to the day where I heard the IMF talking about trying to measure the value of whales or someone trying to do an IPO of the rainforest, but that indicates how the world is indeed changing. So I will now hand over to Hank to give your thoughts about what you've learned from this discussion, how the report you hope is going to be used, and where the future's going.
So, Jillian, thank you, and this has been terrific today, and thank the panel for all of their terrific insights. One big picture idea which needs to be emphasized, and I think Jillian, you've done that, talking about the readers, is that change and policy action rests not only on political leadership, but also on broad public support. That's critical. And this support will be much easier to generate if the public sees a clear, compelling, and concrete economic case for protecting biodiversity. So let me make that case. Biodiversity loss doesn't just mean we lose plants and animals. It poses enormous risks to human prosperity and well-being. Take, for example, the services provided by pollinators that are dying in record numbers. A total loss of these species, bees, moths, butterflies, and bats, could lead to a drop of agricultural output of up to $500 billion annually. And for every contribution of nature that can be measured and given a dollar value, there are many more that cannot. So we lay out a lot of economic numbers in this report, but trust me, we understate the value of nature because scientists are still learning. But consider how the destruction of natural environments brings people and wildlife into contact in a way that can spread zoonotic diseases. This point should have special salience now, given what we know about the zoonotic origins of COVID-19. So then, if nature is so valuable, why are we failing to protect it? The single most important reason is that our political and economic systems and financial markets do not properly account for the services nature provides. Policymakers and decision makers often consider nature's benefits to be free, and market pricing is difficult, sometimes infeasible, so they are often valued at zero. Conserving the environment is not adequately rewarded financially, and damaging it is not appropriately penalized. Instead, the tendency is to prioritize immediate economic gains over the long-term well-being and prosperity of current and future generations. This is plainly not sustainable, and the risks are piling up. And as with any serious risk, the rational response is to hedge. From my vantage point, this means making a comprehensive worldwide effort to value, protect, and restore nature. That's why we initiated this groundbreaking report. Many of you have read about the comprehensive UN report released earlier this week. That shines a very bright light on all the ways the world has come up short on meeting the biodiversity targets set 10 years ago in Japan. We can set targets, but if there's no action, they're meaningless. This report complements a UN study, and that it really drills down and examines global financial flows into biodiversity protection, makes the economic case for nature, and identifies and analyzes in very specific and practical terms the key policies and financing mechanisms necessary to arrest the alarming decline in global biodiversity. Jennifer Morris will speak in some detail about our joint findings and recommendations, but I'd like to emphasize 3 points. First, the role of governments is central to providing the right policy and regulatory structure. They must begin the politically fraught process of diverting subsidies away from environmentally harmful activities and towards those that protect and sustainably manage nature. That's very important. That's critical. Also, tax breaks, incentives, and regulatory requirements all could spur meaningful change. Governments can drive investment in sustainable supply chains through procurement standards, introduce biodiversity offset policies, and implement nature-based solutions as part of delivering climate change goals. Without such measures, the private sector's contribution will be limited to philanthropy. But governments alone cannot deliver the financing needed to protect our planet. This brings me to my second point, the potential of the private sector. As we've seen with the growth of green finance, the private sector is willing and able to invest, but they will only deploy capital for conservation projects that promise economic returns. And so we need to adjust our thinking about nature's value. We should create a new asset class for certain natural resources, such as productive soils, crop pollination, and watersheds. Or as Luis Alberto said, tropical forests. These are all valuable assets, and harnessing the power of markets could help to preserve and protect them from destruction. My third point is that government action to halt biodiversity loss and incentivize the private sector to invest in nature is both important and urgent. I know from my experience that in times of crisis, urgent issues are often given priority over what's important. But properly valuing nature is arguably the most important task for governments over the next decades, and the urgency is increasing day by day. By taking steps now, as governments work to kickstart their economies after COVID-19, the easier it will be to transform how our economic systems and markets value nature. I've always believed that a healthy planet is good for business. It's far cheaper to prevent environmental damage than to clean it up afterwards. For much of my career, this was a lonely position, a very lonely position in the corporate world. But in recent years, something has changed. I've seen a new sense of urgency around nature conservation issues, a rapidly growing interest in the field of green and sustainable finance, and a renewed sense that collective effort can make a difference. So I'm optimistic that investing in nature can, will, and in fact must move into the mainstream of the financial world, and do so soon, so that we can arrest the alarming biodiversity decline of our planet. Finally, I'd like to emphasize that the economic case for protecting nature is compelling. However, we should keep in mind that there is an overwhelming case for preserving nature for its own sake. Nature is a great source of beauty, inspiration, innovation, and intellectual interest. Indeed, of everything that is good about life. In that sense, it is priceless. I hope you will all join me in supporting this essential initiative. And now it is my very great pleasure to hand you over to Jen Morris, the CEO of the Nature Conservancy and our very important partner in this project. Jen, over to you.
Thank you so much, Hank. It's great to be here with you. And I really just want to thank Tom and Cristalina and Luis Alberto for this amazing conversation, great discussion. And thank you to Jillian and the Financial Times for hosting this event. This has been an amazing effort with incredible partners from the Paulson Institute and the Cornell Atkinson Center for Sustainability. Really, this is a groundbreaking report, as Hank said, and it's fantastic to have someone like Cristalina now heading up the IMF in this critical time. As Hank described and our panelists discussed, appropriately valuing, protecting, and financing nature is one of the most crucial challenges of our time. Nature is the underpinning of our societies, our health, and our economies. And as Hank just mentioned, we're reminded of this every day as we increasingly understand the links between the destruction of nature and the spread of zoonotic diseases like COVID-19, which has layered challenge after challenge on economies and communities around the world. In fact, the World Health Organization has even stated that protecting and preserving nature is the most important thing we can do to ensure a green and just recovery. So I don't think I need to convince this audience anymore that investing in biodiversity protection is the right thing to do. But together, we do need to demonstrate to decision makers at the highest levels of government and companies that this is an urgent economic need, that the biodiversity financing gap can be measured, and that there is science-backed, economically sound roadmap to implementing solutions that can close this gap. Fortunately, that is exactly what this report provides. Now, there have been several attempts over the last decade to estimate what we're currently spending on biodiversity conservation and what we need to be spending and how much it will take to close the gap between those two. But now, in the most rigorous assessment to date, we've determined this gap is approximately $700 billion per year over the next 10 years. This is actually at least 300 billion more than most earlier estimates. So now we know how big the gap is, and we know the size of the problem we seek to solve. But what about the how? How do we solve this problem? Well, for the first time, we've stacked up all the building blocks we need to close the gap and demonstrated the relative potential of 9 different finance and policy solutions. 2 of these mechanisms cut the overall need for funding in half with no new investment. Instead, they focus on reducing and reforming harmful agricultural and other subsidies, particularly subsidies that prioritize output and quantity over sustainability and biodiversity. Reforming these systems not only helps farmers adapt to climate variability and promote biodiversity on their lands, but it will also improve food security and nutritional outcomes. Combined with smarter agricultural practices, these reforms can lead to a more judicious use of water, fertilizers, and pesticides, a good thing for communities and for the planet. The remaining mechanisms outlined in the report increase funding flows to biodiversity conservation, such as green financial products, biodiversity offsets, and nature-based solutions for climate mitigation and adaptation. Now, none of these solutions are new, but what is new is the very clear conclusion that we need an all of the above approach. In the last 5 years or so, there has been a concerted effort in the conservation community to leverage private sector investment in nature, as Hank just outlined. This is critical, of course. We absolutely must have the private sector on our side. But we cannot rely on the private sector alone. At the top end of our estimates, the private sector on its own could deliver only $19 billion by 2030. That's less than 3% of the total solution. Our report makes clear that the biggest opportunities lie at the intersection of government policy and private sector investment. The only way we'll close the gap is if we have the right policies, regulations, and incentives, so that the vast majority of private sector spending helps rather than hurts nature. And as Kristalina said, we will then put nature on our collective balance sheet as a critical asset we must protect. As I said, this is a groundbreaking report, but breaking ground is just the first step. Now what we must do is mainstream the idea that biodiversity is essential to economic activity and ensure that these 9 building blocks become part and parcel of every country's economic plans. As we look ahead to next year's UN Biodiversity Convention, where governments will develop a new global framework for protecting nature, we recommend that every country undertake a similar national level assessment of the funding gaps for biodiversity conservation and develop their own national roadmap based on the recommendations spelled out in this report. Once again, thank you, Hank, and thank you to our great partners at the Paulson Institute for convening this conversation. These are exactly the kinds of voices we need together at the table, because it's not just about the environment. It's about people, economies, and our very way of life. We have the tools, we have the roadmap. Now it's time to get to work. I'm pleased to now hand it off to Andrew Caroli, Deputy Dean and Dean of Academic Affairs of the S.C. Johnson College of Business at Cornell University, for our closing remarks.
Thank you, Jen. for the very nice introduction, and congratulations to you, Hank Paulson, the Paulson Institute, and the Nature Conservancy. We are so proud to be working with you here at Cornell to produce this transformational report. You know, we at Cornell and the Cornell S.C. Johnson College of Business in particular are so proud of our legacy of collaborative sustainability research. Together with the support and leadership of the Cornell Atkinson Center for Sustainability, we continue to leverage our experts from food to finance to forge vital connections with partners just like TNC and the Paulson Institute. And for us, it's as much about groundbreaking research as translating that research into meaningful change. And that's what we feel is happening right now with this report. What I take away from this massive, comprehensive report, and I say this with all the humility of a financial economist who pushes research on assessing climate change risks and who knows the heavy lift this kind of work is what we have here is a robust economic case for valuing nature, and especially for the need to capture these market failures of global biodiversity loss. The gap between what is currently being spent on biodiversity conservation and what is needed to adapt and mitigate is tremendous. As Jen just mentioned, $700+ billion per year over the next 10 years. You know, on some level, that's a daunting number, but if you read this report, you will come to realize that it is totally credible. The research team has drilled into the very best of these integrated assessment models that economists have been working with for 40 years now. In Chapter 2, it is thoroughly sized up the size of the conservation capital pool in Chapter 3. And then, you know, in case you're wondering, so now what? It lays out very clearly what governments need to do to protect nature capital with these smart policy reforms, as Jen mentioned, to reduce harmful ag subsidies. But to me, the most emphatic is about the need to foster new financial innovations, rhino bonds, whale bonds, to stimulate funding for conservation. It's about pushing that green bond, green lending market. It's about government working with the private sector to design incentives for corporate disclosures related to natural infrastructure. And as a reader, it seems to me these are totally actionable recommendations to expand biodiversity financing, many of which are, as Hank mentioned in his remarks, all about channeling private sector flows into biodiversity conservation. I would strongly urge all those out there who are interested to pay attention to Chapter 5's detailed plan of financial and policy mechanisms that are there to close the biodiversity financing gap. And I should mention, as daunting as the numbers are that are laid out in this report, there is actually a very hopeful tone in the report, and I ask you to heed that. So let me close by saying, and I'm going to hand it back to Jillian to close us out. I challenge all those of you who have joined us today to read this report. If you're one of these many engaged scholars like myself, discuss it and debate its findings and recommendations. If you're in the policymaker world, start promulgation of these recommendations. If you work in the financial services sector, you know what, you should start figuring out how best to develop some innovative financial products that align with what is going to be coming. And if you're a corporate leader, you should probably expect some new opportunities coming along to help you change your business model as you interact with the biosphere, because the suppliers of capital that you rely on for your business are going to undoubtedly be pressuring you to do so. I do want to mention, if I may, Jillian, that our eCornell Keynotes platform is going to plan to host a webinar October 14th, Wednesday, to do a real deep dive into the report. So for those interested, please watch for that announcement at the Atkinson Center site and join us. And thank you all, everybody, for listening. Thank you, Jillian, for leading us so ably. And thank you, everyone, for being part of Real Change.
you very much indeed for those very rousing call to arms. It's going to be very interesting to see what happens later this month with the United Nations General Assembly, the UNGA meeting, and the degree to which they do or do not specifically put biodiversity on the map. It's going to be even more interesting to see what happens in terms of the private sector response to that. As I said earlier, we've noticed a strong increase in interest amongst the Financial Times readers in stories that have words like natural capital and biodiversity in them, and that may be a leading indicator of the fact that the wider public is indeed waking up to these issues. Earlier today, I moderated a panel with Richard Curtis, the filmmaker who's marshalling a group of pension fund, accounting firms, financial groups together to try and create some change in the UK in terms of how money's invested. And biodiversity is absolutely a key issue for a lot of the public there. And a lot of the financial industry is scrambling to respond. And I suspect that's going to be a theme across the Western world, if not the emerging market too. So thank you to Secretary Paulson, Hank, for putting some hard numbers and some alarming words onto these issues. Thank you also to the rest of the panelists for providing your perspective. And in the meantime, best of luck in figuring out how to take this very important debate forward for the sake of all of our futures. Thank you.